Hello everybody. So for today's video, which is incidentally going to be our final video for this semester, we're going to look at the first decade of the 21st century, the 2000s. So we're going to look at the election of 2000, 9/11, the Iraq War, Katrina, and the election of Barack Obama in 2008, and the 2008 financial collapse. We got a lot of stuff for this lecture, so it may go a little longer than some of the other ones, but we'll try to get in all of it as much as we can. Basically, to start off with, where we left off in the previous lecture, we were talking about the presidency of Bill Clinton. And basically, by the end of Clinton's presidency, which coincided with the dawning of the new millennium, the year 2000, the American economy was at the strongest position it had been since the 1970s. Um, Due to the growth in the tech industry and the end of the Cold War, amongst many other factors, the economy seemingly was very strong in 2000. Unemployment rates were lower because of growth in certain sectors of the economy. Um, Wages for some workers, for more affluent college educated workers at least, especially those entering into the professional fields, had grown. So there was at least the appearance of prosperity. But underneath it all, the economic circumstances that had largely, and the economic philosophies that had been guiding American politics since Ronald Reagan remained virtually unchanged and would remain virtually unchanged by the end of the Bush administration and ultimately, in many ways, remain in effect today. Um, and the result is a further increase in income inequality, um, amongst many other things. Now, to start off with, we'll look at the election of 2000, which is certainly one of the most contentious elections in all of American history for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is that it is thus far the only American election to be decided by a Supreme Court edict. So that alone makes it worthy of discussion. But it also is an election which, in many ways, illustrated many of the trends in American politics up to that point. Basically, it was an election where many people didn't like the choices that they were confronted with once the respective Republican and Democratic primaries had drawn to a close. On the Republican side, after successfully defeating Republican Vietnam War veteran John McCain, who in many instances bucked the leadership of his party on a wide range of economic and, in particular, foreign policy aspects. Uh, the eventual Republican nominee was George W. Bush, or as many call him, Bush Jr., the son of President George H.W. Bush from the late 80s and the early 1990s, the 41st president. And Bush as I mentioned, comes from that very well known family background. He's, of course, not only the son of a president, but the grandson of a Connecticut senator. So this is very, established, very wealthy family. And Bush grew up in privilege. During the Vietnam War, his father was able to successfully use connections to get him a position in the Texas Air National Guard so that he could avoid direct combat duty during the Vietnam War, but still technically have military service under his belt. Um, and to his credit, he did in fact become a fighter pilot. He did learn how to fly F-106 Delta Dagger planes. Um, Might have been the F-102. They're very similar aircraft. Anyway, um, so Bush served in the Air National Guard during Vietnam, didn't have to worry about being sent over there. After that, he made his money in the oil market. Eventually, he became a part owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team when they still had Nolan Ryan on the roster back in the early 90s. And in 1994, he successfully mounted a bid to become governor of Texas, unseating the Democratic governor, Ann Richards. And so Bush, during his tenure as Texas governor, built a popular political following. And then in the year 2000, when he ran against Republican John McCain, largely won by appealing directly to evangelical voters who had been an important part of the Republican coalition since the late 1970s, early 1980s, during the Reagan era, but had oftentimes felt mocked or left out of decision making. The fact that Bush was a self proclaimed born again Christian, like Jimmy Carter, um, and who spoke about his faith frequently, definitely helped him appeal to that group. Um, and so he manages to defeat McCain. On the Democratic side, um, Vice President Al Gore successfully defeated a number of Democratic challengers. The most serious was New Jersey politician Bill Bradley, a former NBA basketball star. Um, and it became a fairly close competition. Many expected that Gore had the upper hand in the 2000 election because of the strong economy and because of the continued popularity of Bill Clinton, which actually, as I mentioned previously, increased after the Lewinsky scandal and the failed impeachment effort against him. But Gore kept his distance from Clinton throughout the campaign. And ultimately, he alienated a lot of voters with his aloof and stiff manner. In one of the debates, famously, when George W. Bush was saying something, he was heard audibly sighing in the background. And so he kind of turned off a lot of people with what many saw as his elitism and his snobbiness. And ultimately, Bush kind of caught up some of that ground in the lead up to the election with what many consider to be his very kind of aw shucks mannerism. Famously, one newspaper editor said that Bush was the kind of politician you could envision yourself having a beer with, which is where that particular expression comes from. And so on the election night, it was very close. Ultimately, Gore managed to eke out a very narrow win in terms of the popular vote, winning the popular vote by around 500,000 votes. But when it came to the electoral vote, it was very, very close. On election night, Gore had 266 electoral votes, and Bush had 241. I'm sorry, 242. And so it was a very, very close election, the closest in American presidential history in terms of the Electoral College. And it all hinged ultimately on one state, Florida. There, the lack of enthusiasm for Gore kind of caught up. And the Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader, a 1960s consumer advocate who had famously written a book that led to the adoption of seatbelts in automobiles across the United States, Unsafe at Any Speed. He pulled away just enough of the support from Gore in Florida to make the election there very, very, very close. To the point where on election night, no one was really clear who had won Florida. And so after sort of this back and forth of first Gore conceding and then unconceding and then declaring victory and then, kind of this back and forth, eventually a recount was ordered um, and proceeded, at which point various questions arose about voter intent. There was questions about these famous floating chads on some of the ballots in Florida. And so this kind of continued for several months because ultimately, of course, for Gore to win, he needed Florida. Um, Ultimately, the Supreme Court, in an unprecedented intervention in a decision known as Bush v. Gore in December of 2000, halted the state of Florida's recount in the election of 2000, at which point Bush was ahead by approximately 500 ballots. And so the presidency was handed to George W. Bush. Again, not the first time, and certainly not the last time in American history that an American a person wins the presidency while losing the popular vote, but technically winning the Electoral College. Um, Now, once Bush becomes president, he dedicates the first few months of his presidency to a number of issues that he had spoken about during the 2000 campaign, including various faith-based initiatives, an effort to reform America's public school system known as No Child Left Behind, which has proven to be immensely controversial in the decades since, because it created an incredible reliance on standardized testing as a metric for student success, something which both students and educators have largely and resoundingly spoken out against in the decades since, um, as well as in many instances because of schools getting failing grades in this metric, the cutting of arts and music programs in many schools, um, which might be why the rock genre is pretty much dead after 2008. But anyway, um, so he focuses on a number of economic and domestic issues for the first few months of his presidency. At no point during the 2000 election did Bush expect that foreign policy would be the focal point of his presidency. Um, the Cold War was over. Many people thought we had entered into this new era. Um, a philosopher named Francis Fukuyama famously predicted in 1993 that the end of the Cold War marked the quote end of history, and the emergence of this new, kind of post-conflict era in global history, which ultimately proved to be laughably short. But anyway, so that all changed rather abruptly on September 11th, 2001, when uh, 19 hijackers, 15 of whom were Saudis, hijacked 4 planes out of Boston's Logan Airport. Two of those planes crashed into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. A third crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth, United Flight 93, once news of the first three attacks had reached the passengers, was overtaken by the passengers but crashed in a field in western Pennsylvania, killing all those on board. Um, the attacks on September 11th, which ultimately resulted in the destruction of the World Trade Center, resulted in the deaths of more than 3,000 Americans, including several hundred New York police and firemen who rushed to the to the World Trade Center site, with the first response being recorded in the first 5 seconds. Um, and ultimately, the 9/11 attacks did have a brief effect on American society. It briefly produced a degree of unity and um, kind of common identity as Americans that hadn't existed in the US really since the 1960s, and really was unlike anything that had happened in the United States since December 7th, 1941, since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Ultimately, that brief period of, kind of renewed focus on, each on Americans and kind of setting aside political differences, it proved to be sadly much, much shorter than the national unity that was produced after World War II. It also, much like the attack on Pearl Harbor, had some decidedly ugly side effects. Um, Incidences of hate crimes against Arab Americans or Americans who appeared to be of Middle Eastern descent, including a number of Sikhs, increased dramatically following 9/11. But ultimately, the most dubious legacy of 9/11 was that it spawned what came to be known as the global war on terror. Just a few weeks after the 9/11 attack, um, President George W. Bush delivered a speech in which he declared that the United States was fighting a global war on terror, dedicating to eradicating terrorism around the world. Now, the way that this was proposed was very vague. It was framed in terms not unlike those of World War II. And as a result, it set up impossible expectations of American victory that would not be forthcoming, and which would ultimately prove to be um, decidedly deleterious on American civil liberties, would have rather significant negative effects on American civil liberties. Um, just a few weeks after 9/11, um, the US Congress debated and ultimately passed a massive expansion of government surveillance capacities known as the USA Patriot Act. Now, the USA Patriot Act is actually an acronym. Each letter of the Patriot Act stands for something. It stands for United and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. Yes, that is actually what it stands for. And so the Patriot Act dramatically expands government surveillance. Partly it was designed to deal with several of the issues that had led to 9/11, including lack of communication between the FBI's counterterrorism division and the CIA, these sort of internal inter-branch rivalries that had resulted in many clues being missed. Um, and that at all is well and good. But moreover, the Patriot Act would lead to, on the downside of things, a rather significant erosion of civil liberties, particularly protection against, you know, limitations against, you know, un, unconstitutional search and seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, you know, investigations of private citizens through the interception of cell phone and computer data without warrants or due process, um, the establishment of secretive courts known as the FISA courts um, that conducted their work completely in secret without any kind of oversight or any sort of meaningful public scrutiny. And so essentially, what the Patriot Act did is it dramatically expanded federal surveillance and law enforcement capacities at the expense of constitutionally mandated civil liberties as outlined in the Bill of Rights. Again, including expansion of surveillance in violation of the Fourth Amendment's guarantee against unlawful search and seizure, the Fifth Amendment's guarantee to due process, the Sixth Amendment's right to a speedy, etc. The massive expansion of federal surveillance authority after 9/11, essentially many Americans willingly traded their privacy, their security, their civil liberties for a rather limited sense of security. The government unveiled through the newly created Department of Homeland Security. The government unveiled a color-coded chart of threats to the United States, with code red being the most severe, code orange being the second most severe, then code yellow, so on and so forth. That basically did nothing but scare the crap out of a lot of people needlessly. Um, and so ultimately, the legal legacy of all this has been this rather dubious expansion of government surveillance, again, at the expense of the privacy of everyday citizens, um, and really the erosion of constitutional liberties as guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Um, this wasn't limited just to the United States, of course. Once the war on terror began, the U.S. initially focuses its attention on Afghanistan, which is where the organization responsible for 9/11, Osama bin Laden's Al Qaeda, was based. Um, Bin Laden and Al Qaeda had used Afghanistan since the mid 1990s as a base for conducting training and plotting terror operations against the United States. Ironically, bin Laden had been trained in the United States, or not in the United States, but by the United States, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when he had come to that country as part of a group of Islamic fundamentalists who wanted to wage jihad against the Soviet Union. So bin Laden had been basically trained by the CIA and given military equipment and training by the CIA for use against the Soviet Union. Well, once the Cold War ended and once the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, um, there was basically this massive power vacuum in Afghanistan and a civil war. And ultimately, a religious fundamentalist sect known as the Taliban emerged victorious in Afghanistan, very quickly putting in place an Islamist government that, amongst other things, barred the formal education of girls, um, put in place severe punishments for all kinds of crimes, including the use of stoning. They destroyed several very visible and ancient Buddhist sculptures that had existed in the country since um, for over 2,000 years, um, and basically turned Afghanistan into a theocracy, for the lack of a better way of putting it. Um, After the Taliban took power, Al Qaeda, which bin Laden had formed in response to the United States, to American troops being stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Persian Gulf War. He begins using Afghanistan as a base to launch terror attacks against the United States, including the 1993 attack on the first attack on the World Trade Center, which was a car bomb attack, which resulted in the deaths of 6 people. Al Qaeda actors are implicated in the 1993 ambush of American Special Forces personnel in Mogadishu. And bin Laden also subsequently claimed responsibility for American attacks on Americans in the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, as well as the attack on the USS Cole in the Gulf of Aden in 2000. So there's a lengthy list of things. After 9/11, the U.S. decides to basically give the government and the Taliban government in Afghanistan an ultimatum that they can either hand over bin Laden or be attacked. Ultimately, however, the U.S. attack in Afghanistan is very limited, consisting mostly of airstrikes against Taliban targets. The ground war in Afghanistan is by and large conducted by a very small handful, initially literally a dozen American Special Forces personnel, and a loosely affiliated group of anti-Taliban fighters known as the Northern Alliance. So basically, for the lack of a better way of putting it, when the U.S. faced its most serious attack since December 7th, the Bush administration basically offshored the responsibility for taking out the people responsible for that attack to a decidedly less than reliable group of foreign fighters. And the result was that after several months, during which the Taliban were briefly routed from power in Afghanistan, um, Osama bin Laden managed to successfully escape out of Afghanistan through the mountains of Tora Bora into neighboring Pakistan, where he remained until he was eventually found and killed during the Obama administration. So basically, the Bush administration in Afghanistan had failed in what many Americans consider to be the principal goal of the United States after 9/11, to find and punish those responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And so after the failure to seize bin Laden in Afghanistan, the Bush administration shifted the focus of its attention from Afghanistan to Iraq, a country which had had absolutely no involvement whatsoever in the 9/11 attacks. But essentially playing into the rampant desire for revenge and the nervous public sentiment that existed in the United States after 9/11, the Bush administration methodically built a case for an American invasion of Iraq. claiming that Saddam Hussein um, had been somehow involved in the 9/11 attacks. Again, he wasn't. And moreover, claiming that in spite of by this point, more than a decade of American and UN sanctions against Iraq following the Persian Gulf War, that Iraq was secretly in the process of rebuilding its program for the construction of not only chemical weapons of mass destruction, but also potentially nuclear weapons. Um, the reporting on these rather astounding claims that the Iraqis were building weapons of mass destruction received very little critical vetting from the mainstream press at the time period, with many articles appearing in the New York Times and Washington Post and many other news media outlets that actually championed and cheerleaded an American intervention in Iraq. Ultimately, a big selling point for the invasion of Iraq came from Secretary of State Colin Powell, a man who had been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during the Persian Gulf War and was widely respected by many in the United States, Republicans and Democrats alike, um, when he gave a speech at the UN claiming that the Iraqis were developing weapons of mass destruction. Powell has subsequently said that he was given false information by the U.S. National Security Team of the time period, which included Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, um, Vice President Dick Cheney, who played a more active role in the Bush administration perhaps than any vice president in American history, some considering him to be essentially a shadow president in many ways during key moments of the Bush presidency. Um, and so eventually, having built public support through basically a manipulation of intelligence information, the a joint session of Congress authorized the use of force in Iraq. And so in the spring of 2003, the U.S. launched a massive military operation in Iraq, employing ground and air forces in what the Bush administration referred to as a campaign of shock and awe. Um, Now, by this point, Iraq was a pale shadow of the military that had been decimated 12 years earlier in the Persian Gulf War. And so, in the face of overwhelming American and British um, military hardware, unlike in the Persian Gulf War of 1991, the UN did not grant a authorization for the use of force in Iraq, as such a declaration was blocked on the UN Security Council by the governments of France and China, um, and which many in the U.S. Laughably responded to by proposing that we rename French fries freedom fries, um, amongst other idiotic things um, that were said about the French at the time period, even though they turned out to be right in the not so long term. But anyway, so the U.S. assembled what it called a coalition of the willing of around 40 countries, many of them members of NATO, including many recent NATO joinees like the governments of Lithuania and Poland, as well as one major ally, the British. And so they launched this massive invasion of Iraq, completely overwhelmed the Iraqi forces, which anybody could have predicted, given the weak state of Iraq's military at the time period. And within 5 weeks, American forces had secured the country. At this point, in one of the most ill-advised episodes, and ultimately one of the most infamous episodes in American political history, President George W. Bush had his GI Joe moment. He put on a flight suit, got into an S-3 Viking aircraft, and landed on board the decks of an American aircraft carrier, and unfurled the banner behind him that said "Mission Accomplished," delivering a speech declaring that major combat operations in Iraq were over. That declaration that mission was accomplished would prove to be decidedly premature. Within a few months, the situation in Iraq rapidly deteriorated. And this was largely because of things that many American military strategists had warned against in invading Iraq the first time around in 1991. Iraq is a country that had been basically drawn by committee in the aftermath of the First World War by British cryptographers um, as part of the divvying up of what had been the Ottoman Empire during the aftermath of the First World War. And so Iraq was basically drawn by committee without any consideration of the region's ethnic or religious divisions. And so this country was created that threw together these three mutually antagonistic, more than three actually, if you include Chaldean Christians. So you have this region that's thrown together by committee after World War One that has um, these various religious sects, Sunni and Shia Muslims who don't get along with one another, Kurds in the north near the Syrian and Turkish border who don't get along with either the Shia or the Sunnis, Chaldean Christians. And so basically, you have this country that have been thrown together that has no history of democracy, that has a long history of ethnic and religious strife and rivalries, and which had only been held together basically through dictatorial rule over the previous several decades. And so when the US forces come in and demolish the government of Saddam Hussein, very quickly those ethnic and religious divisions reassert themselves, and very quickly Iraq becomes a hotbed for sectional religious strife and an insurgency against American forces. Ultimately, this urgency would result in the eventual deployment of more than 250,000, more than a quarter million American servicemen in Iraq by the end of the Bush presidency in 2008. And ultimately, this insurgency between various Muslim sects and against American forces would not only lead to the emergence of even more radical terrorist groups than Al Qaeda, including ISIS, the Islamic State, but it also would claim the lives of more than 4,000 American servicemen, as well as between 100 and 600,000 Iraqis over the next several years. It would also lead to major controversies stemming from the treatment of prisoners by the United States, not just in Iraq but in other parts of the Middle East. Um, One of the early actions taken by the United States after launching the global war on terrorism in late 2001 was the CIA eventually, just a few months later, adopted a internal document that authorized the use of um, enhanced interrogation techniques was the term that was used against suspected terrorists. And it also created special detainment camps for suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where they were held without trial or without access to legal counsel. Uh, at this point, the CIA began engaging in torture of many suspected detainees, some of whom were in fact actual terrorists, like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the architects of the 9/11 attack, who was waterboarded by the CIA more than 183 times, and many of whom were just people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time in Afghanistan or elsewhere. And many of the people who were ultimately interrogated using these enhanced techniques um, were people taken very early in the fighting, many of whom were basically people who had been conscripted by the Taliban. Um, so ultimately, you see this controversy emerging about the use of torture against these detainees and against the basically extrajudicial detainment of suspected Islamic militants at Guantanamo Bay. Um, this develops into an even further controversy in 2004 when photos are leaked showing the mistreatment of Iraqi prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison site. And so the questions about the use of torture, which were ultimately fully detailed in a 2014 Senate report, and the use of these enhanced interrogation techniques were something that became the subject of massive public outcry. Senator John McCain, um, who had been had been tortured by the Vietnamese for 5.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War, spoke out against the use of torture, as did many American politicians, some Republicans and many Democrats during this time period. And this is something that has left a massive black stain on America's international reputation ever since, and certainly raised questions about, you know, what was, how are we planning to attain victory in the war on terror, which at any point never, approached anything resembling victory. Um, in spite of all these things, in spite of the Iraq War, in spite of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal that emerged in early 2004, Bush managed to fairly easily win re-election in that year's election against Massachusetts Senator John Kerry. Kerry, like McCain, was a Vietnam veteran who had been awarded various combat decorations for his service as the commander of a PT boat, patrol boat, or swift boat as they were known, in the waters of the Mekong Delta during the Vietnam War. Unlike McCain, he returned home um, and became active in the anti-war movement. And that became a major subject of the political attacks that were used against him in 2004. Um, in fact, the attacks against McCain were so extreme, and in many cases involved such exaggerations of his wartime record that they actually coined the term swift boating to describe uh, the basically taking a politician's one of their strongest features in Kerry's case, his war record, and then weaponizing it against them to inflict political damage. Ultimately, between the swift boating of Kerry and the activation of cultural issues by Bush, who campaigned heavily on anti-abortion measures and a federal amendment to ban gay marriage, Bush manages to win re-election in 2004 by a fairly comfortable margin. But he doesn't enjoy political favor for much longer after winning re-election. Um, Partly that's because he, after winning re-election, launches onto an ultimately misguided effort to privatize Social Security in the United States, something which backfires on him spectacularly, especially amongst the older voters that have become a core constituency of the GOP by this point. Uh, Moreover, Bush would receive significant flack the following year for his handling of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which struck New Orleans in late August 2005. Um, Hurricane Katrina was actually, in hurricane terms, a relatively mild storm. When the hurricane actually finally reached New Orleans, it had been downgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. But because of decades of neglect of the public infrastructure in Louisiana, the hurricane ultimately breached the levees, holding back the waters of Lake Pontchartrain into New Orleans, and the result was massive flooding. Um, Ultimately, many thousands of people in New Orleans were forced onto the rooftops of their dwellings, most of them African Americans who, lacking access to transport or the money to leave, had been forced to stay behind and basically sit out the hurricane. In the aftermath of Katrina, Bush dawdled in his response, waiting over 4 days before making his first public appearance after the hurricane hit New Orleans, and another 2 days after that before making his first speech. So Bush's response to Katrina and the general ineptness of the federal response, especially the Federal Emergency Management Administration, um, really tanked his popularity. The fact that more than 1,800 people had died, many of them unnecessarily, as a result of Katrina, proved to be a defining moment in Bush's presidency. And the following year, in his second midterm election of his presidency, his party lost control of Congress, losing its majority in both the House and the Senate to the Democrats for the first time since 1994. Um, After Katrina, Bush's popularity and opposition against the war in Iraq begins to intensify. Um, but another factor begins to enter into the picture at this point as well, and that is that the economy, which had been strong when Bush entered office in 2000, begins to falter. Part of the reason the economy falters is because of tax cuts that Bush had enacted shortly after becoming president in 2001 that lowered the maximum tax rate for wealthy individuals from 39 to 35%, which, again, much as it had been in the case with Reagan, when coupled with dramatic increases in defense expenditures that resulted from the post 9/11 war on terror, produced massive deficits by the end of his presidency. So that was one thing that contributed to the increasing recession the continued was the increase in deficits, but also the continued upward redistribution of wealth. Economic inequality, which had marched steadily onward during the presidencies of Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, increases dramatically during the Bush administration, in large part because, again, the wealthy are able to take advantage of tax havens and tax shelters that enable many of them to begin paying a lower effective tax rate than billionaires like Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos and many others. Um, but the other thing that ultimately plunges the country into the worst economic crisis um, up to that point that it has seen since the Great Depression. Obviously, we're living in a moment that is in many ways, many multitudes scarier, um, though obviously the full historical um, fallout of that is yet to be determined. Um, the Bush administration's actions would ultimately plunge the country into the worst economic crisis it would face since the Great Depression, the 2008 financial collapse. Um, the 2008 financial collapse was in many ways a decades long event in coming, starting with the deregulation of many parts of the economy that had begun during the Carter administration in the late 1970s, and which had aggressively accelerated during the presidency of Ronald Reagan during the 1980s, as well as the banking and deregulation that had occurred with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999 under President Bill Clinton. The deregulation of key components of the American economy, the upward redistribution of wealth from the middle class to the top 1%, the stagnation of wages for many everyday Americans as factories offshored production to low labor cost countries like Mexico and China. All of these things led to the gradual erosion of the middle class. But what led all of this to the final point of collapse was ultimately um, the complete lack of any sort of regulatory guardrails in the financial sector. The repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 with the passage of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was definitely a major contributing factor. Um, Really kind of the culmination of decades of deregulation of the financial sector. But the lax regulatory regime that existed under the Bush administration, which slashed the regulatory effectiveness of the Security and Exchange Commission, and which turned a blind eye to, in many cases, nakedly fraudulent activities on Wall Street, ultimately led to the worst financial collapse that this country had seen since the Great Depression in 1929. The primary cause was the housing market. Basically, um, in the years after the passage of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the housing market had become one of the hottest kind of areas of commodities in the United States, with many focusing on a new form of stock derivative known as mortgage-backed securities. Now, this is all very, very complex and frankly above my pay grade, so I'm not going to bore you with the specifics. But basically, um, investors began buying up large bundles of stocks that were based in mortgages, in home loan mortgages. This was something that was one of the results of the ending of the separation of commercial and investment banking that had happened in 1999. And basically, what happens is that investors begin buying these mortgage-backed securities in massive numbers starting in the late 1990s and really accelerating during the first term of George W. Bush with this very lax um, regulatory enforcement on the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so what ends up happening is that there end up being created these new lending agencies created, like Countrywide Mortgage, lending agencies in Wells Fargo, Citibank, a whole litany of others. And basically, what ends up happening is that you get these lenders that offer people the chance to either buy homes or to refinance their home loans. And what many of those lenders are doing is they're preying on people who are poor, oftentimes minorities, and working class. They're extending credit to people who otherwise wouldn't be credit worthy. They're concealing key aspects of these loans that they're giving people. Many of these loans that home loans buyers are getting at this time period feature what are known as an ARM, which is an adjustable rate mortgage. So that means that people are basically being able to go out and buy homes with little or no credit checks. They're given these mortgages with very low interest rates up front, and then within a few months or a few years after they start making payments, hidden in the clauses of these lending contracts are these adjustable rate mortgages, which oftentimes cause their mortgage payments to effectively double or even triple. And so what ends up happening as a result of that is that many, many people are suddenly unable to afford their mortgage payments. Um, and the rate of foreclosures and defaults on credits begins to increase rather dramatically. And this increases after 2006. And it really reaches a head in September of 2008 when one of the largest lending banks in the United States, one of the largest investment banks in the United States, Lehman Brothers, goes under. And this results in a massive um, downsurge on Wall Street that brings about the worst economic recession since the 1930s. And this just happens to coincide with election season. That year, the Republicans nominate war hero John McCain, who had previously bucked the party's stances on a number of issues, including the use of torture against prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere, Abu Ghraib, etc., but who essentially ran a more or less stand-pat Republican platform. He continued to support the war in Iraq. He ultimately made the very controversial choice to choose Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as his running mate without proper vetting, which very quickly, once she entered the public spotlight, revealed that she, for the lack of a better term, was a moron and fundamentally unsuited for occupying the presidency. Um, in contrast, after a Democratic primary that squared off um, then New York Senator Hillary Clinton versus um, freshman Illinois Senator Barack Obama, um, Barack Obama wins the Democratic primary in early 2008, largely by portraying himself as a change agent. Obama was had been born in Hawaii, is of mixed race parentage. His mother is American, his father is Kenyan, and had, after being raised by his mother, attended Harvard Law School, eventually became the editor, the first black person to be made the editor of the Harvard Law Review, and then had become a community organizer in Chicago. Um, After that, he was elected to the Illinois Senate. In 2004, he became the Democratic's keynote speaker at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, attracting considerably more enthusiasm than that year's eventual nominee, John Kerry, with a electric convention speech. And ultimately, in 2008, Obama basically tapped into the growing opposition to many features of the Bush presidency, opposition to the war in Iraq, um, anger at at the lax regulation that had produced the financial collapse on Wall Street, that was resulting in record numbers of foreclosures, and many millions of people losing their jobs, as the country entered into a deep recession. Um, and really kind of portraying himself as a change agent. Famously, the Obama campaign, um, you know, turned the words "hope and change" into these massive, posters that decorated the dorm rooms of college students around the country, including yours truly, who worked for his campaign. Full disclosure, during or volunteered for his campaign, I should say. I didn't work for him, in 2008. And really kind of tapping into the anti-establishment mood, and kind of employing this sort of populist rhetoric, and putting forward this very comforting vision of a post-racial, post-partisan America. Obama handily won the presidency against McCain in 2008. Now, after he won the presidency, having portrayed himself as a change agent, Obama largely failed in bringing the recession to heel. Although Obama had campaigned as a change agent and largely in rhetorical terms rejecting the kind of centrist middle third way politics of the Clinton era, once he became president, he pretty much governed as an establishment, middle of the road Democratic figure. When faced with the task of launching a stimulus to revive the economy, Obama rejected the massive bailout plan, the massive stimulus plan that many in his economic advice, that many in his inner circle and many on the left of the Democratic Party advocated, viewing it as too much. And so he ultimately adopted this very austere recovery program known as the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was about a third less than what many economists felt was necessary to fully reinvigorate the economy. And so as a result, um, economic inequality, and political partisanship and factionalization, which his presidency was supposed to mark the end of, only increased over the next 8 years. And while one can certainly credit Obama for bringing a measured and calm demeanor to the White House and a basic competency, ultimately his failure to deal with the massive economic suffering that was produced by the 2008 financial crisis directly paved the way for the eventual nomination and the eventual election of Donald Trump. And from there, where we go, who knows? God help us. Anyway, all right, sorry. I know I went a little dark and cynical there, which I normally don't do, but I lived through this stuff and it definitely affected me, so I have opinions. But anyway, before we let go, and I know this is a long video, I do want to thank everybody for sticking with me the last 8 weeks. You guys have been great. I really want to thank everybody for checking in with me and everything. And I hope you all have the very best summer. You've certainly earned a great summer. Hopefully, enough things will open up that you can at least do some fun things responsibly, of course. You know, wear masks, social distance, basically, don't be a dick. Um, and, you know, I wish the very best to all of you and hope to see you all in the not so distant future. So, goodbye.